So today we're going to start here. And I asked you to start by thinking about what you think is the relationship between dignity and democracy. What I would like to do is sort of back up into that a little bit before we get there. And what I would like to do first is talk about dignity and equality, because I think that's necessary to understand the relationship between dignity and democracy, as we'll see. And I think it's perhaps the most important aspect of dignity that we didn't cover yesterday. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that relationship. And I want to say two things at the outset. One is that dignity and equality are not the same thing, any more than dignity and freedom or dignity and liberty or dignity and anything else is the same thing. Dignity is its own thing. And secondly, dignity and equality are very, very intricately related. And you know that because you've seen the language from for instance, the UDHR saying everybody is born equal in dignity and rights and everybody has equal dignity, right? So you know that from the outset, when people first started thinking about the relationship, the importance of dignity to human rights law, to peace and justice and freedom, and the relationship between dignity and rights, that equality was an important component of that. And the point, the bottom line, and we'll sort of talk about this, but the bottom line here is just that dignity has to be equal in every person, or else the whole concept kind of falls apart. So again, dignity and equality are not the same thing. But when we think attributes of dignity, what are the qualities of dignity? One of the indispensable qualities of dignity is equality, is that everybody has it in equal measure. Let me just start by asking you about that. I've sort of given you the punchline, if you will, right? The rule, if you will. Can anybody articulate why that is the case? If we're going to take dignity seriously as an attribute of a human being that is important in law and important in rights, okay, that's the whole premise of this, right? If we're going to take dignity seriously, why does dignity have to be equal in everybody? Why would it be, let's say, problematic if I had started off by saying everybody has dignity, but everybody has sort of different amounts of dignity. Everybody's born with different amounts.
That means that we'll end up essentializing a hierarchy in society that's fundamentally against equality.
Say that again.
That means that we end up essentializing a hierarchy in society, and that's fundamentally against equality.
Okay, so if everybody has dignity, let's agree that it's universal, like we said before, but it's not equal, then that ends up essentializing the hierarchy. Did I hear you correctly? And that, of course, goes against the concept of dignity, but that's true, but it's a bit circular, right? So what's wrong with essentializing the hierarchy? I mean, I think you're right that if the rule, let's say from the UDHR, were everybody has dignity, but in different amounts, then we would end up essentializing a hierarchy. So what? Maybe that's better. Maybe that's what we want. Why? I'm going to suggest to you, why is that not what we want? What's wrong with, or to put it in your terms, what's wrong with essentializing a hierarchy? Boy, you're both sitting there, both of you, you're like, I was waiting to see which hand went up first. I'm not sure which one did. No, the two of you. Go ahead.
I think what we describe to have a fundamental deficit is its inherence and inalienability. And I think the moment you say that different people have different kinds of dignities, you're firstly ascribing something that you're not born with, something that you're socialized into. And that starts defining what your dignity is. And that I think undermines the whole concept of it. And secondly, if you have the ability to alienate it, not for just yourself, but for other people as well, then I think it completely robs it of any of its moral or legal force.
Okay. Okay. And then there was, yeah.
I just wanted to say that on his answer, I agree with the on the first part where he said that it will essentialize a hierarchy. But on the other aspect, I think there are various values in our constitution, such as equality and others, which have certain issues with them. Like ideas like some people are more equal than others. I think dignity is meant to go above that and act as a framework which encapsulates all of this. And I think because it's inherent and as you said, it's the same for everyone irrespective of a circumstance. So yes.
So, I mean, I think that's right. Dignity is meant to sort of go beyond that. And I do think you're right also that if we thought of dignity as being unequal, that would sort of rob it of its moral force. You said that very well. And that's why I think we all want to have a system where dignity is equal in everyone, because we want it to have that moral force. But let me just push back a little bit on what you said. It seems to me that you could imagine a universal declaration of human rights that says everybody is born in dignity and rights, and people are born with different amounts of dignity. You're right that you could think of inequality as something that is socially constructed, and we'll get there by the end of today, I hope, and we'll talk about that social construction of inequality, like how we get to be unequal. But it's not obvious to me that you couldn't have a system of dignity, of inherent and inviolable dignity. It has all the other qualities that we ascribe to dignity, right? Inherent, inviolable, universal. It goes to your worth, right? It's all those things. But just we'd live in a world where we'd say some people are born with more of this thing and some people are born with less of it. That seems to me not impossible. And so the question is, why did the framers of the UDHR, which is where we get sort of all of this thinking from, why did they reject that? And why are you right, essentially, that option would rob it of its moral force? In other words, my initial question, why does it have to be equal in order to do any of the work at all that we want it to do? Yes.
So I think in that context, everyone is born with the equal right to claim rights.
Maybe, but maybe not, right? Dignity can still have that quality also. Dignity is the right to have rights. And thank you for remembering that and calling it up. I appreciate that. But people have a different, you were born with a lot of dignity, and so you get to claim a whole bunch of rights, and you were born with, sorry, not so many. And so you get to claim some, but not as many. The point I'm trying to make is that is absolutely, this idea of equal dignity is really essential. That it to me, it's sort of like a house of cards, right? If you take out the equality aspect of dignity, the whole thing falls apart. And so that's why. So I interrupted you a little bit, but did you want to continue?
No, I just wanted to say, everyone has the equal right to claim rights. Ultimately, the right you end up getting, the human rights or whatever fundamental rights you end up getting, that differs depending upon the socioeconomic situation you are born into.
Right.
But overall, everybody has the equal right to claim it.
The right to claim it, right? The fundamental sort of human-based right to claim it, not so much the legal-based.
When we say that some people are born with How do you actually quantify it?
Yeah, well, that is a problem. He said, how do you actually quantify it, right? Well, right. So it's not a measurable thing. You have two and I only have one, right? I mean, but on the other hand, if you think of it as essentially the work it's doing is the right to claim rights, then you can start to quantify it. You were born with the right to claim 15 rights, and you were born with the right to claim 30 rights. And so I want to follow up then, because I on your idea, sort of, you said it sort of most directly, that it robs it of its moral and legal force. Why is that?
It's just how, at least in India, we've defined citizenship based on that rights, right? But the moment you start taking away from it, it sort of, in my head, this structure starts collapsing. And maybe I'm tracing it back to the social contract that most constitutions is to encapsulate. So in my head, I'm just coming from that place.
What would unequal dignity, unequal, inherent, inviolable, again, all the same qualities, but what would, let's say you have 30 of whatever it is, right? And you only have 15. Okay, let's just, we don't know exactly what our units are, but that's okay. What can she do with 30 that he can't do with 15? Or with 2? What's the consequence of choosing to go down a path where we say we have faith in unequal dignity? What could you do? And I want to depersonalize it because it's not about what she would do. But what could a person with more dignity rights, more rights to claim dignity, what could that person do?
I'm online, but could I answer? Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah.
I'm looking around the room. Where is she? Yes, please join in, and thank you for just jumping in, because I don't have a way of seeing if you got your hand raised. So thank you.
Yeah. So I think yesterday we were speaking about how if somebody says my right to dignity trumps over yours. So if you say, I have 30 and you have 15, I get to do something that violates your dignity. But also, I think on a broader level, for example, with political regimes today, I mean, if you leave it up to that, because of how mercurial like each regime's priorities are, you could always play it to that. And if it's unequal for each person, it becomes extremely viable.
I'm sorry, if it's unequal for each person, it becomes.
It's easy to violate because it's easy to justify a violation because you can say in this regime your 15 points of dignity don't matter as much.
That's exactly right. And that's why your point was well taken, and that's why your point initially about essentializing the hierarchy was also right. The point is that if I have more dignity than you, maybe one of the rights I can claim, if I have more rights than you do, one of the rights I can claim is the right to define your dignity, or the right to define that you don't have any at all. And once you're not dignity bearing, once you don't have this dignity, then, all bets are off, right? Then I don't have to treat you any better than I would treat a chair, right? So again, if you put yourselves in the mindset of folks who were writing this in 1948, 45, 46, 47, 48, who knew a thing or two about atrocities, you can start to see why, A, the idea of inherent worth of every human being would be appealing, and B, why they had to say that it was equal in everybody. Because as soon as you allow the possibility that it's not, then one person gets to judge another person's worth. And that's not a good place to be from a human rights perspective.
And unequal dignity will also mean that you have a different access to resources, security, and other rights.
You have different access to everything. Exactly. So and that's again, I mean, when you say it centralizes hierarchy, what you're doing is sort of elaborating and I said, well, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that some people aren't able to claim as many rights in general and don't have access to things. Not necessarily that they don't, but that other people then have the right to limit it, right? And that's what the drafts of the UDHR were trying to prevent from ever happening again. Okay, so, but in this conversation, and this is sort of, in a way, it's just sort of a very theoretical point at this point, which is to understand sort of the quality of dignity as being about human worth. Not the quality of dignity is not equality, but it has to be given out in equal measures or experienced in equal measures for the reasons that we were saying. Okay, so this is all just
just want us to go a step ahead and ask what happens if different people have different, let's say, amounts of worth, and they have differential access to things.
what happens.
Yeah, because a lot of systems historically have been comfortable with that. For example, caste system in India, it assigns different work to different individuals, and it has worked for many years. So, maybe trying to go a step ahead, because I think it's not just that, oh, it's unfair that different people get to have different things. There's something more to that. It's because
No, go on.
so I feel when we say everyone has an equal worth, it comes from the place of self-preservation for the people who are giving these rights to individuals, right? Because if everyone is not equal, the people who are less equal will blow up the system, will blow up the structure. It's really that. That is
Okay.
what is motivating for us to make all these aspirational claims that every individual has equal worth, every individual has equal dignity.
So you could say that the people who have the biggest interest in ensuring that we all view dignity as being inherent and inviolable and equal would be the people who are most vulnerable. But you're saying the opposite,
Yes.
right? So I just want to, I just want to sort of be clear that both claims are possible and they're very different claims, right? So one is the claim that the people who are sort of strongest on the dignity must be equal argument would be the people who otherwise lower end of it. And this is obviously, and thank you for making explicit what was implicit, this is a very big issue. It's a very big issue everywhere in every country in different ways. In India, it's a particularly big issue, well, in a lot of different ways, but caste is certainly one of them. And your constitution, by forbidding untouchability and by talking about dignity, and then your court by really talking about dignity, has sort of cast its vote on one side of this, right? By saying, as between a system of caste and a system of caste that includes untouchability and inherent equal dignity, we're going to go with inherent equal dignity. And it's great in theory, and it's a real challenge in real life, here and also everywhere in sort of different ways, depending on what the particular lowercase c caste system is in any society. But I just want to reiterate the point you made, which is also that it's not just to benefit the people who would be on the I only have 15 points of dignity rather than 30 side. It's also on the side of the people who have 30 who want to maintain peace and want to maintain their system. And so that's a way to give a little bit in order to maintain peace. Interesting ways of looking at it. So I just want you to have like this framework. As we talk about equality, we're going to go from the very abstract, like we were just talking about, to more concrete cases. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the cases. One, RV Cap, which was a case that was actually assigned for yesterday, and the other, the German case. Because they both say interesting things about equal dignity. And what you'll see they say is in different ways, they'll agree with us that dignity sort of must be equal, that equality is an essential aspect of human dignity, the way it's understood in the post-World War II human rights regime. So we'll start with Canada. This is the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. This is section 15. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom was adopted in 1982, and it does not mention dignity. And in that sense, it's like the US Bill of Rights that doesn't mention dignity, and Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights at all, so that doesn't mention dignity. New Zealand doesn't have a Bill of Rights at all, so that doesn't mention dignity, and the UK doesn't have a constitution, written constitution at all, so that doesn't mention dignity. All those countries, India is sort of on its own in the Commonwealth countries that talk about dignity explicitly in the Constitution. Section 15 has two clauses in it. The first clause says every individual is equal before and under the law, so that's just basically saying everybody has equal rights and the right to equal protection, blah, blah, blah. So subsection 1 is the equality guarantee. Subsection 2 says, but when you read subsection 1, nothing in this should preclude any law or program that has as its object the amelioration of conditions of disadvantaged individuals or groups, including those that are disadvantaged on these various bases, right? So section 1 says everybody should be treated equally, and section 2 says that's true, but you still can have affirmative action programs, right? What we're going to call for short affirmative action programs. So in RV Cap, affirmative action programs come in all different shapes and sizes, right? Sometimes they're reservations of seats in a school or something like that. Sometimes they're, contracting privileges, other kinds of things like that. In this case, it's a fishing privilege, and it's actually just a 24-hour fishing privilege. So if you live in an area where where there's a lot of fishing, the First Nations people who live in that area, who fish for subsistence reasons and who have always fished sort of culturally, et cetera, want to continue to do so. But the fishing is so great there that the commercial fishermen come in and they can fish a whole lot more efficiently and abundantly. And so what the government has done is it has said that the First Nations people have a one-day advantage. Fishing for them will open on one day, and the commercial fisher people are not allowed at all, and then they can come in the next day. So it's an advantage to the First Nations people, a disadvantage to the commercial fisher people. And the commercial fisher people sue, and they say, that's treating us unequally. It's in violation of Section 1. We're not getting equal treatment under the law. And the court says, does not agree with the commercial fisher people and agrees with the First Nations people that the preference is valid, okay? Part of the reason I like this case is just to sort of expand your conception of what counts as affirmative action, right? And just sort of how preferences are done in, the specifics of a particular filter. So in reviewing the relationship between Section 1 and Section 2, or the constitutionality of affirmative action programs, given the guarantee of equality, the court says there can be no doubt that human dignity is an essential value underlying the Section 15 equality guarantee. So first, we start off with the notion of dignity here. In fact, the protection of all the rights guaranteed by the Charter has as its lodestar the promotion of human dignity. So partly I just wanted you to see that language because, again, this is a court interpreting a charter, a constitutional Bill of Rights, basically, that does not mention dignity anywhere, and the court has no problem saying dignity is actually everywhere. This is the same thing that the European Court of Human Rights did in construing the European Convention of Human Rights that doesn't mention dignity, and the court says, but it's an essential value of the convention. And the court here relies on a previous case, the R.B. Oakes case, that says the court must be guided by the values and principles essential to a free and democratic society, which I believe to embody, to name but a few, respect for the inherent dignity of the human person, commitment to social justice and equality, accommodation of a wide variety of beliefs, respect for cultural and group identity, faith in social and political institutions, which enhance the participation of individuals and groups in society. So in the case that they're quoting, dignity is one of several fundamental values of the Canadian constitutional system, along with others that are geared towards enhancing the participation of individuals and groups in society. So partly I'm just showing you this to give you sort of a concrete example of how a guarantee of equality and a prohibition of discrimination on the one hand can coexist happily with affirmative action programs. You're familiar with this. You have it in the Indian constitutional system. But I just want to point out the possibility of a conflict and the rejection that there is a conflict by the Canadian Supreme Court. So ultimately, what the court decides is that providing Aboriginal communities, which have historically been disadvantaged, so we're dealing with a particular discrete community that has been disadvantaged, with access to commercial salmon fishing does not demean the dignity of commercial salmon fishers by treating them as less worthy and valued members of Canadian society. And that is why the court allows the inequality, right? There's no question that this is visiting an inequality and adversely, and burdening the commercial fisher people, right? If they could get in a day early, they could fish more, right? So there's no question that there's an inequality and that it's imposing a burden. What the court says here, though, is that that is a legitimate burden. That's not an unconstitutional burden, because even though we're treating people differently, we're not treating the burden group in a way that demeans their dignity. And it doesn't treat them as less worthy or as less valued members of Canadian society. A different inequality might very well do that. The point here is that not all inequalities are unconstitutional, but that the implication is those inequalities which demean the dignity of somebody as an individual or as members of a group, or treats them as less worthy or less valued, that would be unconstitutional. That would be unconstitutional. But in this case, it doesn't. It just gives this disadvantaged community a 24-hour advantage, and so the court's going to uphold it. This is an example of using dignity not as an individual right. They didn't come in with a claim of a right or a violation of dignity. They came in with a Section 15 claim. This violates our equality guarantee. But the court here is using dignity to identify or to draw the line between permissible and impermissible inequalities. As long as the inequality does not demean the dignity of somebody or treat them as less worthy or a less valuable member of society, then it may be okay. If it did do that, then it wouldn't be okay. So it's an example of using dignity to interpret another constitutional provision, in this case, the equality provision. Okay? Now, take a breath, moving on to something totally different. This is a case from several years ago in which the German government sought to ban the National Democratic Party, which is a far right-wing party. And the government sought to ban it because their values were inconsistent with the values of Germany. The court ends up disallowing the ban, not allowing the government to ban it. But before it gets to that conclusion, it has a lot to say about politics, I guess the politics of exclusion and the place of dignity in understanding the political sort of fabric of Germany. So, the respondent, National Democratic Party, intends to replace the existing constitutional system with an authoritarian national state that adheres to the idea of an ethnically defined people's community. This political concept disregards the human dignity of all those who do not belong to its ethnically defined community and is thus incompatible with the principle of democracy as set out in the Basic Law. So it's undisputed that this group seeks to replace the existing German society with one that is ethnically defined, meaning some people are in and some people are out. It's also undisputed that that's inconsistent with the current German constitutional model, which is very much a post-World War II rejection of Nazism model. So there is no doubt that there is a conflict there, right? And notice that the court goes in right away and says this political concept, the reason this is wrong is that it disregards the human dignity of all those who would be excluded, right? So for all the reasons that we just said, the party here is saying, yes, we understand that people with more dignity could then define the rights of people with less dignity, and that's exactly what we want to do. And the court says, no, you can't do, or, well, the court doesn't say that, but the court says what you're trying to do, make no mistake, is a violation of the human dignity of those people who would be excluded who only have 15 points. Okay? There's a lot of text here, but I just want to go through it, because I want you to sort of see the language that the court uses to address this rather tricky situation, right? This is a difficult case. The free democratic basic order is rooted primarily in human dignity. So again, you have this, like, first principles, human dignity is at the heart of this. In Canada, they said it's the lodestar of our free and democratic society. Here, it's the democratic basic order is rooted primarily in human dignity, citing Article 1 of the German Basic Law. The guarantee of human dignity covers in particular, now here's where we're going to get sort of the definition of dignity, like what does dignity mean? And we'll talk about what you wrote in, but this is what the German court says. The guarantee, and you'll see similarities between what you wrote and what the German court said. The guarantee of human dignity covers in particular the safeguarding of personal individuality, identity, and integrity, right? So we talked about that yesterday, right? Those individuality, identity issues, and elementary equality before the law. So again, what we were just talking about, identity, and also equality are essential. This understanding is based on a conception of human beings as persons who can make free and self-determined decisions. Remember the UDHR, which started this whole thing, doesn't say a whole lot about dignity, what it means, why they chose it as the foundation of everything. They don't really give much explanation. The only hint of an explanation they give is in Article 1, where it says, after it says that all human beings are born equal in dignity and rights, that they are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Reason and conscience, okay? This understanding is based on a conception of human beings as persons who can make free and self-determined decisions and shape their destiny independently, right? They have the authority, they have the agency to control their own lives, to determine their own life projects, to shape their destiny independently, because they have this capacity, this inherent capacity to make free and self-determined decisions. The subjective quality of human beings, this notion that we are subjects, right, that we make our own decisions, the subjective quality of human beings is linked to an entitlement to social worthiness and to respect, which forbids degrading people to mere objects of state action. What's the court saying there? Here, I think the court's describing dignity as individuality and identity and integrity, and also saying it has to be equal. And the reason we do this, the reason we pay attention to human dignity is because human beings have this capacity for self-determination. But what's the second part of it saying? The subjective quality of human beings is linked to an entitlement to social worthiness and to respect, which forbids degrading people to mere objects of state action. I think that is a very packed sentence. There's a lot going on there. So if you want to just tackle a part of it, that's okay too. This is very dense. Okay, let's hold off on that. We'll unpack it in a moment. Let's look at the second paragraph here. Human dignity is egalitarian. Talk about that. It is founded exclusively in the fact that a person belongs to the human race, regardless of features such as origin, race, age, or gender. Inherent in the individual's entitlement to respect as a person is the recognition of the individual as an equal member of the legally constituted community. Thus, a legally devalued status of degrading inequality of treatment is incompatible with human dignity. So notice what's going on here. There is so much going on in this passage. First of all, understanding what we mean by dignity, right? In the very much exactly the way a lot of you wrote it, right? This is the reason and conscience piece, right? Why we should respect human beings, all human beings, because they have this capacity. And the UDHR talks about reason in this abstract sense. Here we're getting a little bit more concrete about what we get to do with that reason. Well, we get to make decisions for ourselves. We get to be the authors or the subjects of our own lives. We get to control our destiny. That's what we do with our reason and conscience. That gives us a subjective quality. Humans are the subjects of their lives. But here it gets interesting. This subjective quality is linked to an entitlement to social worthiness. So suddenly we're born with inherent dignity because we have this capacity for self-determination. And what does that do? It gives us the right to have rights, generally speaking, but more specifically, it gives us an entitlement to social worthiness. Now, there's probably a translation issue in there that from the German, that makes me want to not focus too much on exactly what these words are, but you get the idea of what the words mean, right? That in society, each one of us has equal worth, right? And the original and the German word for dignity goes right to the idea of human worth and the idea of living in a way that's worthy of a human being. That's sort of the social rights aspect of it, is living in a way that's worthy of a human being. We see that in I mentioned yesterday, one of the early pre-war German constitutions talks about that. So what we get for being these subjects is an entitlement to social worthiness and to respect, right? How we treat each other and how we live, which forbids degrading people to mere objects of state action, which forbids one person saying, I have more dignity than you don't count as much, you're not as worthy, right? And in doing that, literally degrading or demeaning, like giving less meaning to you because you have less dignity. So this is incompatible with that. And literally what the court is referring to here is that when you degrade someone, you degrade them to the status of mere objects, right? The subjects, we are the dignity-bearing subjects of our lives, and we are the subjects of state action. And when you degrade someone, you make them an object. This is what sometimes called, you'll see in the cases, sometimes it's referred to as the object formula. For those of you who are Kantian, this comes directly from Kant's idea that every human being should be an end in and of themselves and should not be treated as a means to an end. It's an anti-objectification principle. You cannot treat somebody else like a mere object. And that's sort of fundamental in dignity law generally, very strongly in the German conception of dignity as a constitutional value. You see it in cases around the world, including some references to it in Indian cases. So that's what's going on there. And then here in the second paragraph, belongs to the human race regardless of this notion that dignity is egalitarian, which of course we talked about, and it's founded exclusively in the fact that a person belongs to the human race. So we get this notion of belonging, that to be a human being is to belong to the communities of humans, which is why forms of excommunication, exclusion, isolation, whether it's exile to another country or putting someone in jail, has these dignity implications because you're cutting them off. Not to mention other actions, war and genocide, etc., where you're cutting somebody off from the human race, right, is obviously completely incompatible with the idea that everybody is welcome and included within the human race just by having been born human. And what I would like you to start thinking about is how the court here is sort of getting towards this notion of a political community, right? So all of this talk is aimed at, that's why we're talking about participation in democracy today, but really backing into it this way by looking at the notion of equality and how strong it is in dignity law and how essential it is to participation in the political community, because ultimately that's what this is about. So I just want to summarize some of these things. First of all, both the German Basic Law and the Canadian Charter use this language of a free and democratic society. The South African Constitution does that also. A number of constitutions talk about that. And what these courts are saying is that in a free and democratic society, that's the given, that the Constitution is the Constitution of a free and democratic society. In a free and democratic society, dignity is the lodestar. It's the fundamental root of it. Okay? Secondly, sort of the definitions of dignity that we've talked about yesterday that you sort of already knew when you came in here. Personal individuality, identity, and integrity, and elementary equality. And this is just this paragraph, but I just wanted you to sort of see the links in the argument. Because people have personal individuality, identity, and integrity, and equality before the law, that reflects their and also supports their ability to make free and self-determined decisions and to shape their destiny independently. So one leads to the next. And both of those lead to this argument about the subjective aspect, the subjective quality. And I think that's not that important, except that when you see the court in this case and in many others talking about subjective, what they're really doing is contrasting it with objective, right? That to treat you as a subject, I think, to me at least, is less intuitively appealing, but as the contrast of treating you as an object is what the court's getting at here by emphasizing the subjective quality. Because we have this subjective quality, we have an entitlement to social worthiness and respect. And because we have that place in society, we get to the recognition of the individual as an equal member of the legally constituted community. And that gets us back to sort of the political space. So what counts as a violation of dignity in these cases? In Canada, as we saw, what counts as a violation is demeaning the dignity of others by treating them as less worthy and less valued members of society. So again, this notion of dignity, worth on the one hand, less worthy and excluded or less valuable in society, right? It goes to your place in humanity and your place in society. In Germany, what counts as a violation is degrading people to mere objects. This is another long passage, and I just want to walk through it again sort of carefully because I think it says something really important about the quality of dignity as it's understood in sort of the human rights regime, and also goes to this question that we were talking about a little bit yesterday, that we talked about at the conference, this question about collective dignity versus individual dignity. And the German court is very emphatic in coming down on the side of individual dignity, which is consistent with the UDHR and consistent with other constitutional case law. Here's how they talk about it. Even though, it sort of starts in the middle. The effectiveness of this object formula, this notion of you can't treat somebody like an object. Even though it may be, so obviously they're responding to arguments that it was limited, even though it may be limited, it is at any rate appropriate for identifying violations of human dignity wherever the quality of the human being as a subject and the resulting entitlement to respect is fundamentally called into question. So we go to this object formula, this Kantian object formula, whenever the value of the human being as a subject is called into question. It's useful for sort of negotiating, for understanding those situations where the quality of the human being as a subject is called into question. This is especially the case. So what are the situations where the quality of the human being as a subject is called into question? Well, glad you asked. This is especially the case if a perception supports a genuine and thus absolute precedence of a collective over the individual human being, right? So this is the difficult case of collective dignity, if you will, which is when the collectivity, the collective, takes precedence over the dignity of the human being. Human dignity only remains inviolable if the individual is treated as fundamentally free. If, albeit bound into society, so not free like an island, like I can do whatever I want in that sort of complete autonomy sense, but free within society. Human dignity only remains inviolable if the individual is treated as fundamentally free and not the other way around, as fundamentally unfree and subjugated to a superior instance. In other words, if we're going to think about human dignity and value it, we have to always protect the human freedom of the individual. The absolute subjugation of a person to a collective, an ideology, or a religion amounts to a violation of the value accorded to all human beings for their own sake, simply by virtue of their being persons. It violates the individual's quality as a subject and constitutes an interference with the guarantee of human dignity, which fundamentally violates the free democratic basic order. What they're saying here is that in situations where the collective says, we want X, and X is going to demean your dignity, undermine your freedom, limit your free will, then in the German constitutional order, they're saying very, very emphatically, that's a violation of dignity. That the individual dignity has primacy over everything. Because again, to allow a collective, an ideology, or a religion to have primacy over the individual, that also robs it of the idea of dignity, of its legal and moral force, right? Before we were talking about, if I have 30 points of dignity and you have only 15, then look at what I can do to you. Now we're just asking the same question in the context of a collective. All of us here in the middle think that you all shouldn't be part of our group. Or that you all have to do certain things that's going to limit your dignity, your freedom, your free will, your agency, your subjectivity. All those words are the same thing, right? They're all like the essence of why we protect dignity. And if we, as the majority here, decide that you don't have rights, then, or that you have to do certain things in order to be part of our group, then that robs those people of their dignity and treats them like an object. So the same problem of unequal individual dignity applies in the collective context. You might have different views about this, but this is the view of the court, and it's the view of the UDHR. This is generally how it's taken to be. Precisely because, both in the German court context and the UDHR context, because of the history of the Holocaust. Because if you have an ideology that says, we're going to decide who's in and who's not only who's in our political community and who's out, but even who's in humanity and who's out, then you're demeaning the principle of equal dignity, of equal worth. That make sense? Does that seem wrong or right? Are they missing something?
So, general comment from the Indian perspective, but in India, we usually try to ascribe equal value to rights as we do to individual rights, and dignity to each of them also. And in fact, for better or for worse, there have been instances where group rights and group dignity has been accorded preference simply because the point is to allow groups to, especially in the religious context, to exist as a parallel system without trying
To exist as a what?
a parallel system.
A parallel system.
Instead of supplanting it with what the law says. And I think it's important for dignity as a concept to be seen outside the law then, because it's only when it pervades all other systems that define our social existence that we can legitimately use it to give the individual the importance that they need to be accorded. So, for example, this is a highly publicized case in India. It deals with Parsi funerary rights and how once you marry outside the community, you don't get access to the Tower of Fire. And this is something that's been publicized a lot because, on one hand, you've consistently granted group rights to let the religion decide for themselves. But at the same time, you can't say that the individual should be excommunicated because of their choice to marry outside. And so the only real solution, at least in my head, is that to make it more of a universal concept beyond a framework that's supplanted in how the constitutional codes deal.
So how would you make it more of a universal concept?
Obviously, that means more of an engagement from. So this is also a criticism of secularism in the Western understanding of it, as we say it, that it completely ignores the force religion has. And if the point of dignity is to make sure one person allow them to exude that kind of force on someone else's life, then I'm not exactly sure how, but logically it's the only way that you can go ahead with parallel systems.
Right.
And I think this is one of the loopholes in theory, as is that.
Other thoughts?
No, you mentioned UNDHR and German Constitution. They both framed the word dignity from Holocaust. Is it true? Is it true? Is it true? That's what.
I mean, I think there's no question that the UDHR and the German Basic Law were written for many purposes, but one purpose was certainly to create a society that would never again endure the Holocaust.
If it was based on that Holocaust concept, then it is wrong to frame dignity is equal for all, because not one person of that German nation subscribed to Nazi ideology. There were many others. There were people opposing it, and because of that thing, they are bringing out dignity must be equal for all means it doesn't make sense. There are other things to look socially.
I'm sorry, there are other, it doesn't make sense. Why?
Because not all people subscribe to that Nazi ideology. There were people who opposed it, and when they are framing this dignity is equal for all because of that Holocaust thing only, then they are ignoring many other issues within the country, such as minority rights and so on. So we have to.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, and when I just said sort of, they were written for many purposes. I mean, we're focusing on one aspect of constitutional law in Germany or Canada or even India, right? We're just focusing on the place of dignity in these constitutional systems. So I don't want to suggest that the only thing there is in constitutional law is dignity rights. There's a lot of other things going on, and even in India, where you have a very abundant dignity jurisprudence.
To provide dignity for all, there must be some ups and downs. We cannot provide dignity equally to all.
There must be some.
And which some accommodations to the minorities.
Right. Yeah, and I think, I mean, and in a way, that's why I started with the Canadian case,
Yes.
as a way of saying dignity is the foundation, it's the lodestar, and yet also that doesn't mean everybody's treated equally because not all discriminations affect people's dignity. So I could, so there is accommodation in the facts of an individual case. What I wanted you to see here was just the court's doing a strange thing here, because ultimately, I think I sort of hinted at this, but I'll just tell you what the court decides in this case is that the party should not be banned because it has a very limited likelihood of effectiveness. I think this is a 2008 case, but I'm not sure. I just don't remember the year you have it, but which is a decision that it made, right? But in order to not be, so it's going to end up saying that this party, this political party, should have a place in German politics. But before getting there, it's very emphatically explaining why we're going to say it has a place in German politics, but don't vote for it, right? Like, don't support it because it's going against everything that we in the post-World War II world in Germany believe in. So, but for our purposes, I think that's just I think it's an interesting case because it's relevant now in a way that it's just particularly relevant now in this particular moment in history. But also because of the way the court's talking about dignity and the way it's addressing this specific question, which I know is very prominent in Indian constitutional thinking and in Indian dignity thinking. And so I just wanted to give you an example of sort of how, in a different context, this question of collective versus individual dignity is dealt with in this very strong way. So I'm not, it's not about which case is right or wrong. It's just showing you, this is what we do in comparative law, it's just showing you how this issue is dealt with and why, and how the court comes to this decision, focusing on the individual as this dignity-bearing, rights-bearing, reason and conscience-bearing entity that has free will. And that the point of dignity law is to protect one's ability to exercise that so that one can have control over one's destiny, against the backdrop of what happens when a collective imposes imposes conditions that violate dignity. But that's why I brought it to your attention, because I thought in the context of sort of the cases that are prominent here, that it was worth seeing that. Any other comments? Okay. So what is the relationship between dignity and democracy? The cases that we've looked at have hinted about the importance of protecting equal dignity for a free and democratic society. They've made that connection. But in what we've seen so far, they haven't been explicit about what that relationship is. So how would you think about that relationship, the relationship between dignity and democracy? In a democratic, okay, first, let's say your system is committed to democracy. to constitutional democracy. So we're not just talking about majority rules, whatever. We're talking about majority rules within a constitutional system. Raise your hand if you think that dignity, the way you've understood it before, the way we've been talking about it for the last 2 days, is important, is an important value in a democratic system. Raise your hand if you think it's important to a democratic system. Okay, that's almost all of you. A few of you didn't raise your hand. Curious to know why. If anyone wants to share.
It has nothing to do with democracy. And democracy is people will have a vote, and that vote will be the same. That's not necessarily connected to the value of dignity.
Okay.
We associate other normative frameworks, but that's not dignity.
Okay. So you could have a fully legitimate democratic system, put aside the illegitimate ones, but a fully legitimate democratic system that doesn't adopt any of this.
I think dignity would maybe more prominent if it's a socialist republic framework within a democracy. Democracy standalone doesn't have anything to do with dignity.
Okay. So there may be democratic dignity-based rights that you might want in some system, but that's not inherent in democracy. You can have democracy without it.
So I just vote part that we have right to vote in as per the democracy, but still we have the right to choose, like that person, particularly why we want to choose that person to run the country. So that is basically coming from the our self choice that we want to choose it or not. We have the option. So that is, I think it is also linked with the dignity.
So if you think about dignity in this way, right, that these are sort of some of the values of human dignity, those are also the values that give you the vote, right? The reason a system would say, we want to know what you all think and who you prefer to run your country and to whom you want to delegate your sovereign power to. The reason a system would ask the people is because the people are these people, right? With identity and self-actualization and all that kind of stuff, right? So one point is, well, yeah, but you can have democracy without dignity. And I just want to keep that question out there because I think it's a really interesting question. Most of you said that there is some kind of relationship between dignity and democracy. So now it's a question of figuring out what that relationship is. One way we can talk about it is that the whole point of government by the people, which is what democracy is, right, is that the people have this reason and conscience, free will, dignity thing, and they get to decide. And one way I've thought about it is that if we have the ability to shape our destiny individually, then collectively, that's what voting is, right? It's just us deciding how we want our destiny to be as a collective, as a group. So there's at least, I don't think that answers the necessity question, but at least it answers the relationship question. And the democracy reflects this aspect of human dignity. What are some other ways of thinking about the relationship between dignity and democracy?
Dignity, fundamental premise through which we can achieve democracy. And it's based on a very specific understanding of what it means to vote. And it's linked to what you just said. In that, to vote isn't just the act of going and voting, it's also the act of making an informed decision. It's also coming back to the right of full development, the right to live a dignified life where you can actually exercise that. And all of that, unless you give dignity to the people who are actually going to go vote, is, at least in my head, impossible or like very, very hard to materialize. And that's why, based on a dignified understanding of what the people, you go ahead and form a democracy. And that, I think, also leads to democracy furthering dignity, because a government by the people is going to, like on paper, respect the people and their wishes more.
So another way of thinking about it, if I can sort of try to encapsulate that, is that democracy respects dignity, maybe in the way that you were talking about it, but the flip side is, or the inverse of that, is that when the people exercise their dignity, they are creating the democratic polity, right? Democracy works because, so dignity sort of promotes democracy, and democracy promotes dignity in your view, but also dignity is what creates the democratic polity, the community of democratic decision makers, right? Yeah.
So if I really had to get into the definition, like democracy as in like a democratic polity is also a comparative setup where every participant is also equal to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if we see it from that perspective, and going back to the earlier discussion where we said that dignity assumes that it's in equal measures for everyone. So in that sense, when it comes to let's say the right to vote in countries, let's say the US, for the longest time, a certain group of people weren't allowed to vote, or even the UK, women weren't allowed to vote for a very long period of time. And then that shows that somewhere the very idea of dignity in a democracy was sort of not fulfilled, because those rights weren't equally given to everyone. And hence the dignity of, let's say, the African American individuals, or let's say women in the UK was sort of violated, because the fundamental assumption that dignity is in equal measures, which is so important for a democratic setup, was sort of not fulfilled or violated.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And again, that's one of the reasons why I started the conversation about democracy by looking at equality, because they're interconnected, right? And once we accept, if we're going to have a democracy, we can ask people to vote because they have dignity, but the only way that democracy is going to be really legitimate is if we ask everybody to vote equally, right? So that notion of equality comes into how we create a democracy as well. I think that's another important point.
Madam,
Yeah.
that the relation between democracy and the societies like in India, if we use the word the dignity in the context of democracy, that itself, the word dignity itself makes some harm to the society. I mean, all of the things goes into the executive hands itself. Political executives.
I'm not trying to understand. Are you saying that using the word dignity in the context of democracy harms?
Using the word of dignity as well as the application of the word.
Yeah,
Dignity
can harm the democracy. In what way? I'm not sure I understood. I'm sorry.
For example, if we consider the Indian society,
Yeah.
by for the political executives, what they do is they take all of the power into them. I mean, some basic, for example, providing free in government schools. For example, in India, government running schools, midday meal scheme, free meals to the underprivileged students.
Mm-hmm.
They providing food to the students. So in such kind of implementation of the schemes, simply they give the statements. We are protecting dignity, we are giving
By providing food to the students. Mhm.
So, I mean, from the flip side, what they do is instead of providing dignity to these people, dignified rights to these people, they themselves making in an individual manner, they develop I mean, their families like that. So such kind of one-sidedness.
But are you saying the provision of food can be?
I mean, I take it as an example.
Yeah, no, right.
Implementation of government schemes, welfare
Yeah.
schemes, while coming to that point,
Can be harmful to the dignity of people. To say that dignity and democracy are intimately related.
I mean, sorry, ma'am. You used that word dignity is the right of having rights.
Yeah.
So it's my question that even some people, they don't know what is their right.
Right.
That's kind of
Right.
the human being.
So let me I'm going to try to sort of answer some of this, and I'm not sure if I've got the full import of what you're saying, but I'll try. First of all, to say that dignity and democracy are connected is not to say that the laws that are produced by the democracy are necessarily affirming dignity, right? You can vote for people as an act of your own dignity. I'm expressing my dignity by voting equally with everybody else. And then the people that we vote for write laws that do not affirm dignity. I won't name any examples of that, but one in particular comes to mind. That actually just brings us back to more democracy, right? If you don't like what your government is doing, there's a democratic solution to that, which is wait a few months and you'll get a new election and you'll get to make a new decision out of your reason and conscience, right? If in theory, we're talking very broad theory here. Are you agreeing or disagreeing? So that's one part of it. The point here, and we're going to break in just a few minutes for tea, but the point here is just, I mean, I think these are big and complicated questions, and they're not the kinds of questions that you ask and then, instant answer. What you see in the cases is a very strong connection between dignity and democracy. And what some cases will say is that democracy is, in fact, the only government system that respects human dignity, not necessarily because the laws are better, but because it's the one that respects the ability of people to equally participate in this community, right? So this notion of being a member of the community, which they talk about in this way, you can think of it broadly as any kind of community, a religious community or any kind of community, school community or anything else. You can also think of it specifically as a political community and being an equally respected member of the political community. I just want to sort of encourage you to keep sort of thinking about this because it is complicated. And I want to encourage you to think about your point, which is that there may not be a relationship. There's ways of thinking about legitimate democracies that don't depend on human dignity. So that's just something to think about more. Yeah.
I may be allowed to propose
Okay.
a simple definition of democracy is that it is ruled by the people.
Okay.
then it boils down to that at the start of when this, let's say, a framework of democracy started in, say, a state. Let's assume that there are very few people there for my argument. There was a consent-based framework there.
Yeah.
There, let's say 8 people agreed that, okay, all of us will, each year we'll vote.
Yeah.
And if there are more than 4 votes, uh, then
Right. That's how we make our decisions.
So at the end, is it not the case that it boils down to consent more than dignity? Because after you have chosen, that is where democracy stops. Because then there's a system in place based on consent, which says that, okay, every 5 years, everybody will come and vote because that's what you've decided. It's not because we are good human beings, bad human beings, we have some inherent value within us. That would go into the laws which we make within that.
Mhm.
Okay, now these people within this land are also equal in other spheres of life. They have a right to food, shelter, etc., whatever, and XYZ number of things.
Why is your simple system of 8 people, and I appreciate what you're doing there, why do you need the consent of people to get decisions made?
It's the assumption that a democracy is always formed when people come together and they agree that, right, this is how we will do things.
So,
As opposed to other forms of states such as autocracy or dictatorship.
exactly. So what I would argue in response is that asking for the agreement or the consent of people is the way of respecting their dignity. And in fact, we only do it because they have dignity. In other words, we can say we want a democracy where everybody who is affected can vote. But we're not going to give the chairs the right to vote, even though they may be affected by our decisions. We're only giving it to the dignity-bearing entities in our community. But when you get into words like consent and agreement and government by the people are the agents. They're the, well, I don't have it up there anymore, but they're the ones who are self-determining. So that whole system, I think, depends on a conception of human beings as having dignity. And if you had a different conception, if you weren't talking about the dignity of people, you might very well not want a democracy. I don't have respect for your reason and conscience, and I know better, so I'm just going to make decisions. It's only because what I just said is not accepted that we have sort of what I'll call like dignity-based democracy.
I'm just
Okay, one more and then
this is sort of addition to that. Then we also need to think how about the relationship between dignity and other frameworks such as autocracy. Because imagine in an autocracy, we will be then opening a can of worms to say that, okay, those people in an autocracy who have not overthrown the ruler do not have dignity just because they have agreed implicitly that yes, we are not overthrowing him, so he is the ruler and we are implicit in his rule.
so let me just, because I know we have tea and hello, sort of very quickly. First of all, again, none of this has to do with the laws or the political scheme, the decisions that are actually made, right? And whether they're good or bad. That's a whole different issue about whether laws that are passed actually respect dignity or not. We're just talking about the structure here and who gets to decide about those laws, right? So that's first of all. And I think what you're sort of touching on a little bit is this notion of like the benign dictator, right? Suppose we don't have democracy, we have a ruler, and that ruler just does these amazing things for us. We love them to death. They're wonderful, but we never get to choose. And we'll talk in the next part of the class about social and economic rights. And it could be that we really advance, that our dictator really advances social and economic rights, right? Let's assume that we're all living very well under this dictator. There are people who would say that's still not respecting dignity for sort of the reasons that you were getting at, right? Because we didn't get to choose. There are actually cases that talk about the dignity right to make a fool of yourself, or the dignity right to make foolish decisions, right? That to uphold the dignity of individual decision making is not to say all your decisions are great, but it is to say that only you have the right to make decisions that affect you. And that's sort of the heart of the argument. So let's break for 10 minutes.